We can start. Hello, everyone. The St. Stephen's College Northeast Society welcomes you to a panel discussion on Naga Nation. We would like to extend our warmest welcome and gratitude to the panelists for being part of this meeting and to the audience in large for attending the session amidst their busy schedules. Today, we are discussing a pertinent issue at hand. The history of the issue of Naga women's reservation in positions of power ran back to 1963 with the formation of the state of Nagaland. A special provision was made under Article 371A so that no act passed by the parliament could apply if they infringed upon the religious, social, and cultural practices of the Nagas. Many groups since then have voiced themselves that there should be more women representation in the protests. In April of 2016, the Supreme Court or ordered for elections to be held with one-third of the seats reserved for women, to which the government agreed, but it was vehemently opposed by the apex Naga tribal bodies on the grounds that it went against the customary practices of Naga communities and thus was violative of the provisions under Article 371A. This led to widespread protests and rallies, which broke out all across the streets. Recently, the urban local bodies was postponed from election was postponed from February to April due to violent protests and large-scale civil demonstrations. Threats of excommunication and social boycott forced 140 candidates to withdraw, leading eventually to the Chief Minister of the state stepping down, rendering the elections void. For the discussion, we're introducing the panelists. First, we have Theyiesinuo Keditsu, who is the Assistant Professor in the Department of English of Kohima College. She is a feminist and a strong advocate for the revival of indigenous Naga textiles and women's narrative and is popularly known as Mekhela Mama. Her poem Hor has been translated to Gujarati by Sitanshu Chabera. She has completed her PhD in Cultural Studies from Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. We have Dr. Rosemary Dzuvichu, Professor of English Literature of Nagaland University, who specialized in American literature and drama. Her work as a feminist scholar and as an activist has made her a renowned figure across the socio-political spectrum in Nagaland. She is a strong advocate for Naga women's reservation and continues to work with organizations that take up human rights and political empowerment. Now I hand over the charge to Vinolen. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Anu, for the wonderful introduction. And a very good evening, honorable speakers for today, Professor Rosemary and Professor Theyiesinuo, as well as all other professors, academicians, guests, and my dear friends. I will be acting as the moderator for our panel discussion today. And with the introductions out of the way, I will go straight into business. Before we begin with the panel discussion, I would like to mention a few rules which we expect everyone to respect and abide by. So let me begin with the rules. Rule number 1, decorum is to be maintained. This is a formal meet and you are expected to present yourself and act in a civilized manner. Rule number 2, keep your mics off at all times. This goes without saying because we don't want any disturbance so that the discussion can go smoothly. So please ensure to keep your mics switched off or else we will be forced to mute you. Rule number 3, if anyone has any doubts or questions, please put them down on the chat box and they will be, we will ensure that these questions are answered at the end. It's either that or you can keep them reserved for the Q&A session, which will be conducted at the end of the meet. And rule number 4, this one's for the panelists. Panelists are requested to maintain time. So at 15 minutes will be given to each panelist, both the panelists present here today. And at 12 minutes, one of our members will put a message in the chat box reminding that 12 minutes has passed. And at 15 minutes, with all due respect, I will interrupt the speaker and remind that 15 minutes has passed. And 18 minutes is the maximum time given to a speaker. So at 15 minutes to 18 minutes, you are expected to wrap up. So that, and we request you to adhere by the given time frame so that the discussion is fruitful. And rule number 5, and maybe perhaps the most important one, since this is a critical topic and a very controversial topic, is widely debated by academicians and politicians alike, we request everyone to please keep an open mind, maintain proper decorum, and listen to one another. before jumping to conclusions. As Aristotle put it, it is the mark of an educated mind to be able to entertain a thought without accepting it. Now with the regulations for the meat out of the way, let us proceed without further ado. Honorable Professor Theyiesinuo Keditsu, also popularly known as Nekla Mama, you may now take the floor. Madam, please enlighten us.
Actually, I would have preferred for Professor Rosemary to go first. But anyway, good evening. And before I begin, I want to say what a privilege it is to be sharing panel space with Professor Rosemary Dzuvichu. She's a woman who has not just worked for Naga women's rights, but has often persisted at great personal risk. She's a feminist icon here in Nagaland, a role model and a mentor to me personally. Had I known that the St. Stephen's Society had approached someone with her wealth of knowledge and experience on this issue, I might have suggested that she deliver a lecture instead. One I would have gladly attended because there's much we can learn from her. So yes, please consider this as a disclaimer of sorts as I begin my presentation. I'm merely a scholar on this subject, and I honestly don't know what I can add to someone at the front lines. The topic given for today's panel discussion is tribal rights and women's rights, Naga women's reservation. Rights in this context is understood as legal entitlement granted to citizens by state legal institutions, and in the case of the Nagas, by customary laws via Article 371A of the Constitution. In our case, unfortunately, there is very little overlap between tribal and women's rights. The former covered by our customary bodies, and the latter pursued to some extent by modern legal institutions of state. This is not to say that there are no needles in the haystack. A lot of my work has to do with finding these needles. However, given that Nagas are not a monolithic homogeneous people, but rather a conglomerate of diverse tribes, the tenor and modality of patriarchy across each of our tribes and cultures is as diverse. We have tribes where there are provisions for inheritance of ancestral property by women, to cases, albeit exceptional, of women participating in legal disputes, to the prohibition of women to own any kind of immovable property, and their absence from certain spaces justified as taboo or even ritual. And while I say this, I think it's important for us to acknowledge that patriarchy is at large and pervasive. And if tribal is substituted for communal or citizens' rights, then also we can say that women's rights in practice is always a thing apart, at odds with a discourse of collective rights, because as long as humanity's default setting is patriarchal, which it most certainly is, then categories of tribal, communal, citizen, and even collective are synonymous with men's rights. In this sense, the circumstances of Naga women is not exceptional at all. We are only looking at variance in terms of focus and degree. Whatever comforts, safeties, and entitlements Naga women have enjoyed and continue to enjoy in tribal life, they do so at the pleasure of the men in their lives, fathers, brothers, clansmen, and leaders. And while modern education, institutions, and governance do not explicitly discriminate against women and are technically open to men and women alike, traditional hierarchies within kinship and community and the powers derived therein, if not directly, then definitely affect how women negotiate and navigate these modern spaces and avenues. So on paper, Naga women usually fare much better than their counterparts across the country in the modern, non-traditional arena, be it education, health, and statistics on crime or violence against women, etc. But take any Naga woman, my co-panelist and myself included, who is vaguely empowered in modern terms by virtue of their achievements in education or career, or their freedom of appearance or social and spatial mobility, And we find one common experience that binds us together is our perpetual awareness of the Damocles sword of patriarchal authority hanging over us. In our tradition, and further reinforced by the Christianities we follow, a father's word is final, and by extension, man's word is final. This may be one possible explanation for why what began as an unprecedented movement of Naga women in terms of strength and solidarity in support of 33% reservation in ULBs was finally subdued and reduced to a squad of sisters left to stick their necks out to pursue this issue. So the irony of today's topic was not lost on me. The word reservation really does convey our response and condition as women subjected to patriarchal surveillance. Women are the reserve of men. We are reserved by and for them. We reserve ourselves or part of ourselves for or from them. A reserved woman is a docile body in the Foucauldian sense. Reserved women are valued, rewarded, and raised up in Naga society. And women's empowerment is celebrated and facilitated only when it is within the boundaries demarcated and maintained by patriarchy. Temsula rightly uses the term benevolent subordination to describe the condition of Naga women and the goodwill and lack of ill intent. This term clarifies why many Naga men express genuine and sheer incredulity at the idea that Naga women may be unsatisfied with our often extravagantly gilded cages. I hope this allows us to understand why the other non-punning idea of reservation was perceived to be so threatening to Naga society and way of life. Because reservation for women, this time it's ULBs, but it could be for any other thing in the future, the setting aside of gender-exclusive quotas, either within the reserve of men or outside of it, contravenes cherished ideals of the reserved woman. There are enough Naga folktales about Naga men who have cohabited in conjugal bliss with women for a considerable duration before suddenly discovering her to be a monster, animal, witch, or some such uncontrollable and certainly unreservable entity, and without a second's conflict of conscience reacted by smiting her in usually very gruesome ways. Let me elaborate what I mean by reservation within the reserve of men. In Naga society, land is the reserve of men. True, in some tribes, women have been known to buy lands with their own incomes. In some tribes, women can even bequeath these to their daughters. But as I have said, this is at the pleasure of the men in the village. At any point, a male kin can lay claim to these lands. And if there are no daughters to inherit them, this land is not passed on to the next female closest of kin, but rather reverts back to the male line. The reverse does not hold true for when there are no sons to inherit immovable property. These are passed on to the next male closest of kin. And mind you, all this arbitration on bequeathing and redistribution is done by the men, who are the final authority in these matters. We know that for Nagas, identity is not possible without land. One cannot claim or articulate one's Naga identity without a geographical referent, be it a Naga. To be a Naga, male or female, is to be from a tribe and a village situated on actual material land. And this land is the reserve of men. So when it comes to urban legal bodies, there are 3 municipal councils, namely Mokokchung, Kohima, and Dimapur, and 19 town councils. With the exception of Dimapur, all other municipalities are situated on land either acquired by governments, British or Indian, or included by subsequent administrations and private settlers from village land. Let our rights as Indian citizens be what they may. The authority of each tribe over the lands on which these municipalities are built is absolute. While some tribes may be more liberal with regards to sale of land to those from other tribes or to the government, others are more orthodox and prefer to lease at less profitable rates rather than transfer ownership. Even if sale has occurred, it is not uncommon to see landowners reclaim properties even after generations have passed. Land, like women, is the reserve of men, and it can be owned by parties from other tribes at their pleasure. And by land, I don't mean only the actual square footage area or the habitation on it. I also mean the kind of habitus that comes with being an owner, which must always defer to the authority of those men belonging to the tribe in whose jurisdiction the town falls. The local joke about a Sami man who beat up a laborer in Dimapur simply for looking in the direction of his native district Zineboto underscores how deeply land structures habitus, identity, and relations of power. This helps us to appreciate why the idea of setting aside a quota for women in ULB elections met with such vehement opposition. The idea of a reservation within their reservation, and not one initiated by them, but imposed by no less than the government of India, at once challenges their patriarchal power and exposes their powerlessness, if our fraught history with the Indian state is anything to go by. But what of village development boards? VDBs provide for not less than 25% reservation for women on the managing committee and have observed this quota since 1980. After all, VDBs came into existence because of government legislation. Well, firstly, the Village Development Board was institutionalized only after mass grassroots campaigns that secured the consent of village councils. Secondly, and this is the most important point, the Village Development Board is a statutory body that functions under the primary village authority, which is the village council. And finally, members of the managing committee are chosen by the village council. So you see why no issues were raised regarding the 25% reservation for women in VDB managing committees, because this conforms to that model of women empowerment I painted earlier, one in which men exercise their prerogative to choose women and to supervise their activities and performance in office. While there are cases of women in managing committees successfully lobbying for a productive utilization of funds set aside for women, cases of women being appointed as the secretary of managing committees, of women in village councils and even women heads of village councils wielding considerable power, these are exceptions. One only has to peruse the body of research published on the actual dynamics of VDBs and managing committees to learn about the relegation of women to figureheads, puppets, non-entities, and mostly members reserved to perform the tasks patriarchy reserves for women, such as preparing and serving food and tea, while the male members convene, and above all, to reserve any reservations they may have as silent spectators. Mind you, this is not the women's reservation bill we're talking about here. In Nagaland, the most important task assigned to municipal and town councils are to manage sanitation and the price of food and essentials. The greatest tangible risk posed to society by allowing women to exercise power as councillors is that we may end up dirty and hungry. The violent protests against 33% reservation only serves to highlight the real threat posed to patriarchal authority as exercised in part by and through the village council, but also informally extends to municipal and town areas in insidious and formidable ways. With the selection of candidates, as well as their election to office by the general population out of their direct control, who knows what kind of women would become councillors? God forbid that unreserved women end up in their ranks. These are concerns raised even during the latest deliberations on 33% reservation held last month, not ironically by all male members of the Nagaland Legislative Assembly, tribal hovos, and village councils, wherein it was wondered aloud whether the moral character of hypothetical women candidates, apparently discernible through things like marital status, past history, etc., should factor in on their eligibility. But the tide seems to be turning in favor of implementing 33% reservation. What landmark decision by the Supreme Court could not achieve has been accomplished by choosing an alternative route of argument, namely the funds that have been withheld by the Finance Commission for non-compliance. This, under the 14th Finance Commission, was 20%, and the 15th is 50%. So if there is one thing that has become as or more consolidated than patriarchal power in Naga society, it is our pathological dependence on funds from the center. For once, this addiction may work in the interest of women. This is not to say that one agrees with the specifics of 33% reservation as laid out by the Constitution. The setting aside of wards where only women will contest against women, and that too only for a single term, after which, based on rotation through drawing of lots, another set of wards will be set aside where women will once again challenge only other women. While male incumbents enjoy multiple terms with the minor sacrifice of one to accommodate this cat fight of sorts. And judging from the fact that the not less than 25 reservation in VDB managing committees has remained unchanged since 1980, while other states have not only implemented 33%, but have also increased to 50% in Panchayat and ULBs, one may be forgiven for being pessimistic about 33% reservation. But until such a time that our legislators at the center can really confront the patriarchy plaguing political parties and institutions, we must remind ourselves that beggars, whether of power or of money, cannot be choosers. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for your wonderful and insightful talk on this very important issue. Now, moving forward, I welcome Professor Dr. Rosemary Dzuvichu. You may now take the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and good evening, everyone. And thank you, Theye, for such a wonderful opening on the whole issue of tribal rights, women rights, and the situation of Naga Women Reservation. When I got the invitation to speak this evening, you must remember I've actually stayed off the whole topic since the last crisis that we've had. And we have been observers on reactions of the Naga population till date. We need to remember that women reservation is not something that is new to Naga society, no matter what kind of slogans and what kind of disturbances happened. Right from the village council, the system of the village council and the village development board working system, which is there in more than 2,000 villages in Nagaland, many of them with success stories. We do have reservation for women in terms of seats and in terms of funds. So they're getting 25% funds, which they're utilizing well, and 25% of seats, which is in existence in all villages in Nagaland. So this is something that's mandatory. Secondly, most Naga people thought when women came to the streets about women reservation, that this was something that Naga women were asking. This is the 74th Amendment of the Indian Constitution, which provides 33 reservations for women. Nagaland does not come under the purview of the Patriarchy Raj, hence we do not have the percentage of women like 33 or even now to 50 in the Patriarchy Raj. But as far as the 74th Amendment is concerned, Nagaland does not Nagaland falls under that purview, and therefore it is mandatory. It is a law for us. It's a mandated law. The reason why Naga women took a legal battle to the court was by 2009, 2010, when the tenure of all town councils and municipal councils ended in Nagaland. No one was keen to have another election because of the Nagaland Municipal First Amendment Act, which ensured that women would come in, 33 reservation of seats, and secondly, 1/3 chairpersons of municipal councils and town councils in Nagaland would have women chairpersons, something totally unthought of and someone totally unimagined for the Naga population, including its women. Here, I would not even like to think of our men alone, but you must remember the resistance to women reservation has also come from so many women, educated women, and this is also because we are under the totally socialized mindset of patriarchy, that what our men say is right, what our tribe says is good, and therefore we cannot question. But I think now we are at the turn of the 21st century. Times have to change. There has to be a fusion of tradition and modernity. And therefore, when we speak of tribal rights and women's rights, we really need to go beyond that concept of what democracy means to the Naga people. What is democracy? If we are looking at the Naga society, I think we need to redefine our terms of what democracy is. Naga women are almost half the population of the Naga society. And therefore, in such a situation, where are Naga women, particularly in terms of their space in decision-making bodies? And therefore, this reservation is to do with the ULBs, we know, but it's also to encourage women to come into decision-making bodies. When you follow the legal battle that happened between the Joint Action Committee of Women Reservation and kindly remember that Naga women from all tribes came together. Eastern Naga Women's Organization, the Watsamondang, the Naga Women, the Naga Mothers Association and its tribe units, and they formed a committee called the Joint Action Committee for Women Reservation. And therefore, this kind of legal battle took the case, the writ petition, into the High Court, into the division bench, and finally to the Supreme Court. And the matter was not on women reservation. The matter was a call for municipal election. If you look into the legal papers, you will find that the call was for holding municipal elections in Nagaland. Because for so long, under all kinds of excuses and guises, both the government as well as the tribal hohos had brought out a huge debate questioning, and that the law itself was questioning Article 371A. The court papers will clearly reveal that the court had struck down the argument of the state government that this reservation for women in ULBs has nothing to do with Article 371A. In 2016, when the interim order was passed, it was made very clear that there is relief to the petitioners and that the state should conduct the municipal elections. And we all know the drama and the consequences that happened. I think the very fact that today we are here again debating this is interesting, because now we have a government, almost a conglomeration of all those politicians and figures who had a very big role to play within the reservation crisis. All of them are there today in a united government. And I think as someone who is advocating women's entry into the ULB, and to clean our towns and cities, I see something very positive happening, because when those who were anti-reservation and those who were for reservation and for implementing it, and those who were supporters of women coming into the fray and into these councils, we may see some positive developments in the near future, is my belief, for the very simple reason that the debate with the tribe hohos against reservation was not only because it is against Article 371A, customs and traditions. What is customs and traditions? Customs and traditions that don't allow women any visibility in decision-making bodies is what they meant. But at the same time, if you look at what they were really talking, they were totally against the very idea of women coming in for open elections. They said, no, We've always selected you all. We've always nominated you all. And therefore, come in through nomination. If you come in through nomination, even 50% we're willing to give you. And I'm telling you, that is a stand of our tribe leaders, where they're willing to nominate women of their own select choice with full voting rights, maybe even to a percentage of 50% at that point of time and the crisis. But how are you going to handle crores of rupees? How are you going to handle a municipality? What kind of women are coming in? Women who've been selling booze are the ones who are coming in as candidates, So the total underestimation of women candidates, and the amount of women who had filed and had tried to file their nominations, it's interesting because when you look at the background of these women who were coming in, most of them were young, educated professionals in almost all the towns of Nagaland. So my argument is going to be, so what if a woman is selling booze? It is with selling of that kind of traditional wine that she's in most towns in Nagaland. They are the ones who have actually managed to educate their children. And therefore, let's not bring in questions of morality and candidature into these kind of arguments, which our society has been debating upon. Because when one is to reflect upon the candidates that had been there in most of our town committees, particularly even in the committee in Kohima itself, a lot of them had problems with alcohol. And therefore, that is not to say that only women who are alcoholics or who are drunkards are going to come into the scene. So that, I think, is a very myopic impression that one really gives to the whole of society. Interestingly, I think the Naga women reservation debate has opened up Naga society to the rest of the world. It has exposed us to the inner core. It has really shown that we are actually not practicing Christians, because what is the question of equality? Who is a woman? Who is a mother? Who is a sister? Who is a wife? So when attitudes change according to gender and the gender that you are really discriminating in your society, where women are not given, where women are not given ancestral property, even if you are the only daughter, and your whole property goes to the nearest male relative who may be many cousins away. Questions of acquired property being given to the daughters and then being taken away by parents. We've seen in questions of sexual violence, in questions of customary court judgments, where women have been discriminated to such an extent that I think we need to redefine the very notion and the very idea of what democracy means to Naga society. And this is a very concerning idea of for us, especially women activists, who are looking at Naga society and trying to look at the kind of spaces that we occupy. Fortunately, for those of us who are vocal, who are articulate, who are educated, who have the courage to stand up, you're already defamed, you're already branded, and therefore you are not the kind of woman who actually is popular or who is acceptable to the very notion of what a Naga woman should be. A Naga woman has to be exactly the kind of definition which Theye has already described. What are we looking ahead in the days to come? Naga women's reservation is not going to go away. I feel as long as we are under the Indian government, and under the Indian constitution, we will have to mandatorily implement this law. Elections will have to be held. Women candidates will have to come in. We will have to see whether they're going to come in by elections or whether we are finally going to have, again, discussions on nominations and all that, starting up again, because I think in many tribes, the discussions have already started. But one main problem which most of our men also had with regard to reservation is not customs and traditions, no. It's the very idea that 1/3 of women are going to sit as chairpersons in your towns. So the main question for them was, what do they know? How are they going to implement these laws which are there under municipality or in the town councils? How are women going to sit there? So I think the very idea that our whole society is driven by these kind of understanding of what womanhood and women mean to us is really mind-boggling if we are to think in terms of feminism, and if we are into think of women who speak about rights and who fight about women's rights. Today, Naga Women's Reservation is not a battle between men and women. It's about the future of women. It's about the future of daughters. It's about the future of your sisters. And I'm glad this evening I see so many of our young men also sitting here. It's important to debate and to open up. And I hope the discussion that is about to start will really bring out, discussions on how we can go ahead. How do we change? If culture is to be static, where are we then and where are we going to go? And if we are talking about a reservation which is under an Indian law, what is the future when Nagas, sign an accord and we do get a semblance of independence? What kind of a future is being planned ahead for Naga women? Are we really going to be in that traditional mindset that you stay there, we decide for you, we love you? And Naga society is such that, we really see it as patriarchy, but paternal patriarchy, because our language and our tone is different. They will always tell you, we love you, we care about you, we protect you, and therefore we know best what is good for you. Not election, but nomination. We nominate you, we select you, you can come in, and this is how you occupy the spaces. Fortunately, I think the success stories in the VDB is a lesson for all of us. The VDB system, despite all its shortcomings, we have also seen success stories where women VDB groups have bought land which is such a strong commodity for us, and the very fact that Naga women do not have access to ancestral land. I think the very fact that acquired land is possible through these VDB women groups, 25% of the funds that go to them, they have landed up in buying land, in acquiring land, in growing things on that land, and in also opening grain banks during the lean season when there's absolutely no grain possible for the poorer women. Naga society is also very clear on its feminization of poverty. Who are the poorer ones? It is the women. And therefore, to think that Naga women and men are equal, we live in a democratic society, educated women, we have equal rights, and therefore, why are we asking for reservation? To all those who would be still arguing, and many of our young people who live in cities, who've seen the best of everything, I think these are kind of thoughts that would be going through your mind. But we need to remember that back home in rural areas, which is more than 80% of Naga women living in poverty and in these rural areas, we will see the real situation of where Naga society really is. If we look, because this is a Northeast society, I'm also expecting that other students from other states are also watching and interacting in this. If you look at Assam Assembly has already passed that it will implement 50% reservation for women in municipalities. Tripura already has success stories of 50% reservation for women, which is enacted by the parliament now. It has become a law. 33 is redundant, actually, and we are still fighting for our 33, whereas the rest of the country has gone into 50. Sikkim, which is such a small tribal state, Sikkim has already implemented 50% reservation for women, 33 reservation of jobs for women in their state. And I think all this goes to the kind of political will that these leaders have. Mizoram has already implemented the women reservation. Manipur, the municipal area, the valley area, has already implemented 33 reservation for women in municipalities. So if you think that other tribal societies have not implemented, Arunachal is still yet to, because Arunachal has very successfully implemented the Panchayati Raj. Successful women Panchayati Raj leaders have actually stepped into the assembly, into the Arunachal assembly. And therefore, these kind of empowering mechanisms where women are led from one stage to the other have really groomed them to step further into politics. And the very fact that we actually don't even have a single woman in the Nagaland Legislative Assembly speaks volumes of where we are today, particularly in terms of decision making. Thank you.
Thank you, madam. That was passionate talk. Actually, already crossed 15 minutes, but then we were talking with so much passion, and like it was so interesting that I decided against interrupting you. So I hope the other society council members will forgive me for that.
Thank you. Sorry.
I will take the meet forward into the next phase now. A very exciting phase, if I'm being honest. Robert Quillen once said, "An argument is an exchange of ignorance. A discussion, on the other hand, is an exchange of knowledge, where the aim is not being victorious, but bringing in progress." So please allow me to welcome our Northeast Society Journal Head, Imcharenla Longchar, who will be moderating the discussion session. Just as the ancient Greeks discussed problems and issues of their time, we will be doing something similar, something on similar lines. Imcha, over to you.
Thank you, Vinolen. Thank you, Dr. Keditsu and Dr. Dzuvichu. I'm sure we're all more enlightened than when we first began with our conversation. What I found most interesting about all these conversations is the sphere of paradox that we live in, that women have been at the forefront of peace negotiations, but have not been accorded a position into bodies trying to bring the movement to a solution. That women have been entrusted to manage households and everything that comes along with it, but with also an increasing number of women juggling careers, and yet we have not received political recognition as electoral contenders. That men would protest wearing against reservation, wearing traditional garments woven by females, and seeing how entrenched patriarchy is to the extent that they would bring Article 371A, citing it to counter on the grounds that it infringed customary laws. How do we as women situate ourselves in this narrative, in this paradox? The floor is open for any of the speakers to pitch in.
Yeah, Imcharan, I think I would like to respond to that. Just an observation and a commentary too. Regarding, I really agree on women doing so much for peace and for peace negotiations, and yet we find ourselves not at the negotiating table. And this is also something that we, the Naga mothers, have broached on many occasions, both to the Indian interlocutor as well as to the Naga political groups. And this is also due to the fact that very few of our Naga political groups have women who are also of a high-ranking cadre. Because when you're talking of negotiations, political negotiations, one, it has to be women from their own Naga political groups. And two, as of now, the government of India has really not thought of peacemakers being there, rallying around the peace table. I think the UN Security Council resolutions of women's right to peace and security has made it very clear that women have to be a part of that decision-making body, that women have to be a part of any peace process. And I think the days ahead, hopefully, will change, because we are not going to just finish off overnight. I think the process is still going to continue. And also the very idea that we constitute half a population, and yet the citing of Article 371A literally hangs like a sword on our heads, because Article 371A and customary laws and traditions, I think, have been very selectively interpreted throughout in terms of women's rights particularly, because whenever any discussions on women's rights crop up, there's always a very selective interpretation of customs and traditions and customary laws. And I think this is the kind of paradox that we find ourselves in. We really need to step out from this, but who takes the lead? It'll have to be change of mindsets of the whole society, including our men. And to a large extent also, I think the responsibility also lies with many of our young educated women who can make a change and who can also sensitize others. So there's a lot of responsibility on the onus is also on us, because only we ourselves, we can empower ourselves and not expect our men all the time to empower us.
Imcharenla, I'd also like to respond because in terms of what you were saying about situating, I think in terms of traditional Naga society, it's more or less based on the segregation of sexes. As much as we say that certain domains were exclusively male, certain domains were also exclusively female. And so one of the things that one part of sort of modernizing, and I'm speaking as a very sort of open and proud feminist, is one of the projects of feminism is also to question these segregations. So as much as we want men to rethink their ideas of femininity and the capabilities of female power, I think at the same time, we as a society, men and women together, also need to reevaluate what we understand to be masculine or our notions of masculinity. And I think if we can do that, these traditional segregations will be less set in stone, more permeable. And I think that's something that perhaps I see as one way, one non-violent, sort of less dramatic and disruptive way of, creating understanding between the sexes. And perhaps looking for ways to build solidarities across sexes and genders to work for, truly something that is a real democratic process.
Thank you. In conjunction to the question, Dr. Thay, in a recent conversation, you've mentioned that feminism isn't opposed to patriarchy and that it transcends gender. How then do we break the ceiling of what is masculine and what is feminine and initiate less public and more private mediations when constrictions begin at home? And how do we mitigate this tussle between ancient customs and modern democratic ideals? Do they always have to remain opposite tangents for indigenous communities?
The first thing I want to say is I agree with, I think you've quoted me correctly, except on one matter is that feminism is not, I don't think I said feminism is not opposed to patriarchy. I said feminism is not opposed to men. And I think the conversation that you're referring to, I elaborated that, patriarchy is something that transcends gender and sex. Women are patriarchal, men are feminists. So, it really, I just want to emphasize this. I emphasize this everywhere I go. It's not a man versus woman issue, it's patriarchy versus, I think a far more inclusive and progressive project of feminism. So that, but yes, I think that, when we look at Nagaland, the way we are, we're number one, we're a very small community. It's actually almost practically possible to physically meet somebody, physically meet every single Naga, in Nagaland. It's actually possible. And so we need to look at what this possibility opens to us, in terms of the logistics of dialogue, the logistics of peace building. These are things that are, they're more convenient and achievable possibilities are available to us just by the fact that we're a very small people. One. Second is we're actually quite a peace-loving, conflict-avoiding people. And this is true for all cultures. Maybe, yes, sometimes we Nagas fight, but we rarely fight in, and I think that's one of the reasons why the protests against this 33% reservation took everyone by surprise, because we're usually not like this. We Nagas don't fight like this dramatically and openly. We really sort of, I think all of our tribal cultures have built So and I thought it was very interesting when you sent us the mail that you thought that this would be a very contentious issue when, the guidelines, and I appreciate that. But I also thought that, in a sense, it was very contradictory to the way we Nagas discuss things. We are actually not combative people, and we are very capable of having intense disagreements without raising our voices even by this much.
Thank you, Dr. Keditsu, and I'm so sorry for the error. Dr. Dzuvichu, would you like to add anything to the conversation?
Yeah, I was thinking that when you reflect and go back to that reservation crisis, the kind of violence that came up was also politicized. The involvement of political parties, the scrambling for the chair which the sitting chief minister was then sitting on, actually culminated in mobilizing youth, in mobilizing party youth, in mobilizing all kind of connections of parties. And I think this was what led to the tragic developments for women. And for the first time, even for women like us, it was so alarming to see not the kind of hatred and the kind of responses to the women reservation on those of us who were in urban areas, but the kind of violence that was perpetrated on women in the rural areas, on women leaders, candidates in the rural areas. I think these are kind of practices and habits which we don't have in our Naga society. Unless you're a criminal, unless you have committed a crime, the whole community does not latch on to you. And unfortunately, the politicizing and the misinterpretation of customary laws and misinterpretation of the Municipal Act by itself actually led to so much of violence. And I do agree with what Thea had said, that actually we can be very civilized. Many people thought that we would never be meeting the tribe Hohos. We did meet on many occasions. We had such wonderful discussions. They even hosted us, wonderful. The last discussion that we had, which was basically on you women must come in for nomination and not election, was actually a lunch that was rounded up with so much of hearty discussions. But we Nagas also do not say everything when you meet face to face. The after effect of the lunch was alarming, and we saw the kind of violence that had come. But to a certain extent, and to a large extent, if we are to compare ourselves with the Indian mainland friends, I think it's very clear that we really don't resort to shouting and insulting people, and we really don't raise our volumes unless we are forced to do so. And I believe, especially women, that is the kind of traditional grooming we have. Is it a conditioned kind of grooming? I don't think so. It is definitely a part of our culture where we can be very courteous, we can be very biting, but to a large extent, I think we know very clearly where our rights are and where we stand on our rights.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dzuvichu and Dr. Keditsu again. This has enriched our conversation further, and I think we're ready to proceed to open the floor to all the participants here. So I hand over the floor to the Talks Department.
Is there anyone among the listeners who would like to add to the discussion before we jump into the Q&A session? Okay, I guess not. We will move ahead. Thank you so much. That was an unbelievably great discussion session. Now we have come to the last part of the event. And since we live in an atmosphere of democracy, it will simply not be right if we do not allow each and everyone to participate. So if you have a question, please find out the answer in this session. It's as simple as that. Ladies and gentlemen, I now announce the Q&A session open. People with queries and questions may now put forward their cases. Thank you.
Hello, good evening. Hello, good evening. Am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Yes,
You are audible.
Thank you so much. First of all, very much thankful to the organizers for conducting such a wonderful and meaningful meet, and to the resource person. Actually, I am so honored to be here because I am a former student of Dr. Rosemary from Nagaland University. So to meet her here and then to hear her once again, it's making me feel young once again, and I'm very much honored to be here. It's a kind of question as well as a thought from my side. Given the fact that Naga society, Naga culture is rooted in oral tradition, that is a non-fact. Writing, it came with the outsiders, as we all know. So Naga society were rooted in oral culture. So may I please request the resource persons to kindly give their opinion on how much impact or role does oral narration have on the mindset or the attitude of the Naga? As we all know that oral tradition is not just past oriented. Oral tradition is something, oral narration is the link that connects the past and the present. So in my humble observation, I feel as though this oral narration, be it folklores or folk tales, it has impacted somehow the mindset of the Nagas in general. But I would like to hear from the resource person a further elaboration of this point. Thank you so much.
Professor, would you like to take that, or can I take that first? Or yeah. No, you've raised a very interesting issue, and in my talk I also referred to the number of folk tales where men cohabit happily, as in it, and not just happily, it's actually conjugally also with women only, and then when they discover some aspect that is cannot be managed by patriarchal authority, they proceed to kill these women. So this is one, but also I think in addition to this, something that I observed or I heard when I listened to a talk regarding reservation was actually one of the women leaders suggesting that we codify customary law. And I think that is something that I'm absolutely against. Our customary laws are oral, and the orality, the oral character of customary laws, from the studies I've done, actually has allowed for a lot of leeway for women, in terms of when you actually trace, when you go and try to find oral narratives of customary proceedings, you actually find that many of our traditional cultures are not as patriarchal as they seem. There has been a lot of provisions. There've been a lot of judgments where, the village body or the community has decided in favor of the woman, where women have actually been given property. So yes, there's a balance. I don't want to romanticize it, okay? But the thing is, there are exceptions. And, with law, exceptions are the thing because they set precedents. And one of the things about codification is it actually endangers, these sort of flexibilities. Also because when you do research or when you ask people to narrate, one of the first questions that Naga people, especially elders, ask is, are you going to write this down? Is this going to be official? And the minute you say yes, many of them defer. They refuse to speak, So in a sense, orality actually is a domain that has a lot of potential for ensuring some kind of gender justice, one. The second is in terms of actual folk narratives. I've written an entire book of poems based on the folklore of Sopunyo, which is a story about a woman who leaves an unhappy home with her child. And this is, again, if you look at the general tenor of Naga customary laws, which Naga woman is able to leave her home with her child and go back, So this is something that gives a lot of, promise for the kind of rights women have even within marriage. The folktale of Ukyepenyofa, the Angami folktale of Ukyepenyofa, I find is particularly outstanding because it actually traces our ancestry back to a mother, a woman who is without a husband. So you can imagine that, because in the sort of discourse of 33% reservation also, the marital status of a woman, what happened in their marriage, what is the condition of a woman's marriage, all these things come up. And again, in my talk, even now in this latest discussion also, these matters keep propping up. There's always this constant moral policing and always this preoccupation with whether a woman is under the control and, oversight of a man, whether her husband is there to keep her in check. So having said that, just imagine that we Angamis actually have a folktale that traces our ancestry back to a woman who left her husband, or her husband left her. It doesn't matter. She was without a husband. So these are small examples. I can continue telling you lots of folktales. But yes, the space of orality, whether it is, in terms of formal orality in customary law, or whether it is in the form of, more creative folk narratives, does give a lot of, space and holds a lot of potential for us to explore gender justice.
Yeah, Non-Lee, I hope you're doing well. Good to see old students anyway. I'd like to give a small comment on this because as far as oral tradition of the Nagas is concerned, one problem that I see is also the selective interpretation. Always, who tells these stories? It is the men. It is not the women who tell these stories. Now we are fortunately having women who are writing our stories and who are articulating our stories. Our stories have always been his story, articulated by men. And therefore, I think our main problem has been, over the years, we have seen this misinterpretation, selective interpretation of the kind of stories also about our own society and where we are. That is one, about orality. The fact that it can be misinterpreted, it can be selectively interpreted, and therefore in such a situation, what do? We have to ensure that the right story is conveyed through the kind of storytellers that we have. Time for Nagas also to retell our stories from the women's perspective and also rewrite our women's history, which has always been the domain of our men. That is one. Secondly, as far as codification, because we need to touch also on codification is concerned, the government has been very excited about this codification of customary laws. For Nagas, this is going to be one of our biggest dangers because no Naga village has the same customary law. Forget the tribe, even one village to the other, we have variations in customary laws, in the kind of punitive judgments or the kind of punishments that we have in terms of crimes, in terms of maybe even in terms of judgments. And therefore, the minute you codify, then the whole system of what is really your identity, what are really those sanctioned judgments, what are those gray areas, which are actually gray areas where women can also negotiate their spaces. I think all these will lose out in the codification. As activists, I think we have demanded for quite some time to have our customary laws written down. Writing down customary laws and not codifying it and look at our Prime Minister and the Uniform Civil Code. I think the Nagaland government is moving towards this Uniform Civil Code, which is not at all practicable in the sense, particularly in relation to Naga society. Way back, as early as maybe 2014, 15, we were already debating about the UCC. And as far as Naga women activists and Northeast women activists are concerned, we've been totally against codification.
Much thanks to both of the resource persons. Thank you so much.
Okay. Before we move forward to the next question, there's a question on the chat box which I would like to read out, and either one of the, or both the panelists can respond to it. So the question is, what role does the church play in providing an ideological justification in legitimizing institutionalized patriarchy in Nagaland?
Well, I, for one, have always been very critical of the role of the church, particularly in terms of gender justice and women's rights. If we look at our churches in our state, one, you will find that there's so much of emphasis on our male theologians and pastors and reverends. We do have churches that do not allow women to step into the podium as reverends and even as pastors. And this is again depending upon the tribes. Some tribes have appointed reverends and pastors. Some tribes literally forbid to have women being raised up to that. We've had cases in interactions where actually women deacons in rural areas have even stated that when they were elected as deacons, they were asked on Sunday to sit down there with the rest of the congregation, while all the male deacons had to sit up there on the podium with the rest of the men who were the pastor and the assistant pastor and whatever. So with that small kind of an example, I think we already know where our church is. The church really needs to redefine the very idea of what gender justice is all about, gender equity is all about, particularly in the Naga context. We have so many theologians and church leaders who have been educated abroad, exposed to the kind of cultures, the struggles that women have had in other countries. It is time now to really pay attention to the struggles that Naga women have here as far as gender equity, justice is concerned. And I hope to see in the coming days, the Catholic Church, for that matter, has a gender policy brought out by the Catholic bishops of India, which is very, very lucid and clear about where women should be as far as church decisions are concerned. Hopefully, we will also have changes in the various church denominations and councils in the days ahead. But I think as far as equity and gender equity is concerned, we do look forward to the church to play a huge role in empowering women, in bringing women up.
I think I'm in total agreement with Professor Rosemary. We were just talking about customary laws not being codified and how that actually allowed women to negotiate more power within traditional patriarchies. And what Christianity did was give us the Bible, which is an absolutely codified and sacred, sanctioned, set of laws on how women should behave. And I think it's really, you're lucky because you have a Catholic woman and a Baptist woman speaking today, some bonus. So I'm going to speak from the Baptist perspective, but, Baptists in general, we identify, on the very sort of extreme right fundamentalist, side of Christianity. And one of the things that, defines Baptists is that we literally interpret the Bible. So when it comes to, any interpretation in the Bible that tells women either to shut up or cover their heads or, not participate or not interfere in church governance, etc., these have more or less been interpreted or not interpreted at all and taken literally. So in a sense, what our conversion to Christianity did, in my opinion, is it actually set women's rights back, beyond our indigenous traditional time, back to literally, sort of the Middle Ages or whenever, the Baptist denomination came into being. And to this day, the Nagaland Baptist Church Council is yet to have, the sort of the head, the sort of, yet to have a women's secretary, or even, I think, a woman member of who exercises some real power. So again, I'm just repeating what Professor Rosemary has said, but yes, one thing that makes me very optimistic is that I have read the work of theological scholars, Naga theological scholars, who are now beginning to re-examine, the Baptist doctrine and structure and practice that we have inherited from our American forebears. And may I remind you that, these are Americans, Baptists, who came to us in the 1920s, in the early 1900s. So we haven't really interrogated that old one, So in a sense, even for, the Baptist denomination globally and in America in particular, because we actually are inheritors of this very distinct American brand of, Baptist Christianity. Even in America, yes, I agree that the Baptists have played a significant role in the formation of the new Christian right, to the detriment of, both the nation of America and Christians all over the world. But on the other hand, we also have, churches within the Baptist denomination in America and globally that are beginning to rethink this denomination and the doctrines and their practice. And I feel very optimistic because Naga theological scholars here also, women and men, are beginning to examine what we call Christianity and looking at ways to indigenize that. And in that process, to looking at ways in which we can achieve gender justice and still remain Christian.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zokum Zanga. I hope that clarifies your doubt. Now we have another question from Shimre Jong. I'm sorry if I butchered that name, but please pardon me. The question is, could you please share your insights on the primary village authority, who is the ultimate decision-making body in the tribal society? How does a woman address her grievance in villages when she is not comfortable to share amongst the male counterpart, who are the village authority members? Since this is a very long question, panelists can have a look at the question personally on the chat box. Thank you.
Yeah, Shimri. I think as far as the ultimate decision-making body in tribal society is concerned, definitely it is a village council, which is a council of only male leaders. And none of our councils as of now, except for the exception of the village council chairman in Naharbari in Dimapur, we have never had a woman sitting there in the village council. What does she do and how does she take her grievances in villages? This is one of the main questions that have always been shared, because when women are unable to share their problems with the village authority, and here I would not talk in terms of development or in terms of access to land or resources, which is non-existent, but I would like to talk in terms of crimes. Because you have a village judiciary where women are brought forward before the village judiciary in terms of, on questions of divorce, on questions of crimes against them, rape, sexual violence. In most cases in villages, you will find that she becomes the butt of the joke of the whole council and also of the Gamburas and also of all the village judiciary. This is one of the reasons why the Angami women had come up requesting that women be allowed to be also members of the village judiciary. That is one. The AWO, the Angami Women Organization, made it a point and fought their way into the Angami Public Organization. And this is, I think, the result of their struggle, where today you have 2 women executives in the apex tribal body, the Angami Public Organization, where grievances of women can be taken into the apex body. As far as the judiciary is concerned, I feel that the judiciary is more important than the village council, and this is where women have always been at the receiving end. We are yet to have women who are appointed as women gamburas who will be a part of the village judiciary. And you must remember the gambura in the question of the Sumis and the Konyaks, you do have by tradition. In the question of the other tribes, you do have by appointment from the deputy commissioner. And therefore, it is important for women also to lobby for appointment of women gamburas so that women also can play that kind of facilitating role in the village councils and in the village judiciary. This is going to be important. As far as the customary courts are concerned, where you have the dobashis, again, the dobashi is appointed by the deputy commissioner, by the government. A lot of representations have gone in already asking that the state government appoint women dobashis also. But can you imagine our tribe leaders and our men reacting to these kind of representations, which has been lying there in cold storage? So what are we looking ahead in the days to come? We have to look at gender-sensitive politicians, gender-sensitive leaders who will come into the chair and who will change policies for the society as well as for the state, because everything is so interconnected. Unless policies change in the state government and with a gender-sensitive leader, I think it is very difficult to percolate it down to the village councils or in the village bodies itself.
Professor Rosemary's, I think, said everything, and I just want to add a comment, is that, recently our local papers published again that Naga women are the safest in India, and we have the best statistics when it comes to crime against women. And just because, on record, I want to say this is because most of these crimes go unreported, whether it is quite rampant child sexual abuse or domestic violence and rape in rural and urban settings. These go unreported, and especially in the village context where everyone knows everyone else, and men, enjoy power through the village council. These remain, in the realm of silence. And so I think we need to re-examine these statistics and perhaps not look at them as, points of pride, but look at maybe all of us together, since there's so many men and women here from the Northeast and from Nagaland, look at ways in which we can restructure these statistics so that they more accurately represent the state of women.
Are we going to look at the next question?
Yes. The next question is by Mr. Longchar.
Yes.
Naga women seemingly dominate the academic and intellectual domains, yet find no representation in the political domain. Would like to ask the speakers why they think there is such a disconnect between these domains. Also, what would it take from Naga women to be able to transgress this division?
Yes, I think till now, the problem has been women not being able to make a mark in the electoral scene and into entering the political decision-making, which is definitely the assembly here in the context of Nagaland. But we must remember that many women have come in as candidates, and therefore there's not a question of women not getting enough candidates to come in, but it's also a question of choice. Most academicians and most educated women that we have come across do not have any interest. Many of them do not have interest in coming in for elections. On the other side, there are many of them who are also interested in coming in. The question of all these political parties, how do they come in? Because the political parties actually give tickets, and give tickets only to women of their choice. and probably women who have been their cadres and who are not well educated, they would definitely be threatened by someone who's well educated, can speak for herself or can speak for her rights and the rights of other Naga women, and therefore she would definitely be the last choice. This is the present scenario. Secondly, political parties have offered party tickets to many educated women, so we shouldn't get into the notion that political parties do not approach academic women or women who really know how to speak. But the question here is, if they are not interested in politics and in the political arena, then that again would be one of the problems we are seeing, and we are already seeing this within the setup that we are looking at. There's a question on writing of folk tales, folklore, and also whether we are really trying to codify by preservation and appreciation of it in the current time, and whether we're really solidifying our customary laws in this. I think we also need to remember that when women interpret stories, when women write stories, it is very different from the way stories are narrated by men. There are variations in the way women writers will be writing their folklore and their stories, and we have just begun. Women, and why have we just begun? If you look at the kind of stories that have been written over the years and the kind of stories that Naga women are writing now, Naga women have been so busy looking after their families in the kind of armed conflict that we live in. It is only lately that women have had time to relax and think and listen and read and write. I think there's so much more to be done, and the kind of stories that are coming out will be stories from women and not from men. And definitely, therefore, the kind of folklore that comes out will be from women's perspectives. And I think those are the kind of changes that we will also see as far as customary laws and traditions and customs are concerned, because they definitely will be interpreting it from their own perspective. I'm sure Thea can.
To answer the first question, just to add to what Professor Rosemary has said, money. Women don't have money, and you need money to win elections in Nagaland, And so then this goes back and ties into customary laws that concern inheritance and property. All the Nagas here will know, and then maybe some non-Nagas, for your sake, I will tell you that a lot of money is spent for Nagaland elections. And a lot of that the liquid assets are acquired by borrowing money against immovable property. And immovable property is, as I've said in my talk, only men, possess substantial immovable property. Even if a woman candidate is to go, she must ask the consent of her, brother, the patriarchs of her family, in order to take loans against immovable property, even if it belongs to her. So you see, it all ties into, re-examining all of customary law and practice. And I think that is what is so terrifying about having women in formal politics, whether we start from, something so small and harmless like urban legal bodies, or we begin to really engage in debates about the Women's Reservation Bill, which is, always there looming, sort of some kind of beacon of hope for all the women in India. And having said this, it's not only Naga women. If you look at all Indian women, we are grossly underrepresented in politics. And all of this ties down to the entrenched patriarchy that structures political parties, political practice, political execution. So as I've already said in my talk, when we talk about the situation of Naga women, it essentially, as citizens of India, it essentially goes back to, the condition of women in India, all female, citizens of India, and whether political parties, the big ones like the BJP right now, the Congress, whether they're really actually willing to deliver on promises that they make every single election for women empowerment, women representation, whether they're really willing to restructure their political parties, to to overhaul political practice to include women. Having said that, again, tying into this, Virginia Woolf said that for a woman to write, she must have a room of her own and money. And that, goes to answer the second question, in terms of how we write. And as a poet, as a woman who writes poetry, I think this is one of my principal concerns, because right now, the situation of Naga women, we're at a very critical point in which I think all Naga women, especially those, I'm not going to say just education, because, we have orality on our side. So it doesn't mean that only us educated who can write can speak. And we must encourage women, even in our families, in rural areas, women that we encounter who may be illiterate, and especially, the older women who are still, custodians of a great wealth of oral narratives. And so it's very important for us women, whether in written or oral form, to, have our narratives reach as many people as possible. And I think if there is any such thing as, a feminist intervention, if there is any such thing that we women can do, is just to speak and to write or to say, to narrate, and have our narratives, also, if not occupy social space, even perhaps, overwhelm social space, but I think why not exploit this stereotype of women being verbally verbose and, do something subversive? And having said that, I just want to point out how Professor Rosemary has emphasized, educated women candidates. And this is something that is always emphasized. But we never emphasize educated male candidates. And many of our current representatives are, not even vaguely educated and can't even pronounce the words of the departments, which they run. So, we must also recognize this double standard. If we are going to hold potential women candidates, whether in the ULB or in our legislative assembly, to such high moral and professional standards, perhaps if we held our male candidates to these very same standards, we may actually end up with a legislative assembly, a tribal ho-ho, a village council with men who are as progressive and may work towards accommodating women in the political process.
Thank you so much for answering that question. I think we now move forward to the next question, which is by JL. It says, do folklores and stories contain implicitly within them some of the customary laws of the Nagas? If so, how do we understand the writing down of folklore? For the sake of preservation and appreciation in current times, are we, in a sense, codifying, solidifying, and preserving our customary laws when we do so? How do we negotiate that with the leeway? How do we negotiate that with the leeway that the oral medium provides? How do we understand authorship in the light of this?
I think I had already commented on that. Maybe Thea would like to add some more.
I think when it comes to codifying folklore, codifying, but when we talk about codifying, we're talking about, written texts that have legal backing. And so, or folklore can never really be codified, but yes, I agree with you that folklore in Naga culture, as well as all over the world, are means by which certain practices, certain social standards and ideals are transmitted to the next generation. Having said that, I think each generation according to our times, according to what we know, is able to interpret and reinterpret these written folk tales. So what may have been an instructive folk tale maybe 50 years ago can now be a cautionary folk tale, So I think it depends on the interpreter, and I think it's sort of liberating to think that we can read against the grain, in the same way that we do with the decolonizing project. I think this is something that we can also do with our traditional oral folklores, whether written or oral.
And thank you so much. We are almost getting ready to end, but before we do so, I myself have a question for the panelists, and then forgive me if I go here and there, because this is a very impromptu question I planned on asking just while the meet was going on. My notes are all over the place, so I actually read an article online by Dhanya V. Shankar of Gregorian College of Advanced Studies. It talked about how liberal feminism vouches for ability of women to maintain equality through actions and choices. We all know that. So in the Naga context, liberal feminism contends that female subordination is rooted in a set of customary and legal constraints that blocks women's entrance and success in the so-called public world. And this has been, according to him, has been proven right by the turmoil in Nagaland when it came to the women's rights reservation thing. So does the liberal feminism movement, does it have its path blocked in a path into Nagaland blocked by the how do I say this, like a wing of a group of very conservative group, and that uses the Article 371A, which is quote unquote Nagaland's messiah in many ways. So is the Article 371A being used as a scapegoat in a way? And then the actual intention is, the patriarchy that holds power in Nagaland, like it has been mentioned throughout the meet. And in this context, does it make the current Naga society, when it comes to women reservation and when it comes to liberalizing Naga society, does it make two sides, where one side is a very conservative group and uses the conservation of tradition as their motto, and the other group is the group that wants to harbor in modernized changes, which also includes liberalizing of women and their positions in Naga society? So does it kind of reflects how the left and the right in the French Revolution National Assembly was represented. So in this way, in a way, do you think, I wanted to know your opinion on whether education is something that can change this? Because I know of many families, our families, Angami families, who in a way they do give land, they do give immovable property to their women. But it comes, these are rare cases. And then the thing I've noticed is that these are people who are educated, who are civilized, and they, in a way, I'm pretty sure, since they are, the education plays a part as well, but then they give immovable property and land rights to their female members. So does education play a role in breaking these customary laws? And we have seen throughout history, we have seen in the abolition of slavery, Settlement Act of English Revolution, we've seen even in the Protestant Reformation, we've seen even in the civil rights movement, that education, when a large group of people are educated, if they can liberalize their society. Because in this context, customs and traditions are being used as sort of, it's being, it doesn't matter whether it's customs or traditions. The thing is, there's always a right and a wrong. So in this context, are the customs and traditions being used as are they the villain in this context? That's what I wanted to ask. and what is the way to move forward?
I'll take that up and then Thea can add. Vinolen, I strongly feel that there has to be a fusion of tradition and modernity. And I think that's where we are heading to. For many of you who are living in cities, probably you're thinking that, we will not see changes and Naga women will not see changes. I think we are going to see changes in the sense that there has been a lot of sensitization going on. Our tribe leaders have also been educated to a large extent on what the law says, what reservation is all about, and what this whole struggle is all about. So, if I'm to be asked the reaction of what the present status is and what really is the status of our society, I think we are seeing a gradual change of people learning to appreciate women and also their rights and understanding that if this is so, if this is what reservation is all about, then there has to be some kind of space created. The question will be, how do they come in? Is it going to be election or is it going to be nomination? Those are still being thrown up, but I think I'm still quite positive on the way ahead. I really wouldn't see this as a battle between liberal feminists and the custodians of customary laws, because if you look carefully at who were the real people who were spearheading against this whole process of not giving women their rights, it was not custodians of customary laws themselves, actually. People in the villages did not really understand, and it was totally misinterpreted. The act itself was totally misinterpreted to them. It was educated people, it was educated men, it was it was a group of many eminent lawyers too, who were trying their best to misinterpret this whole idea of what reservation was. Do we see ourselves as liberal feminists? There are many women who are activists, who are feminists, and who go back to their homes every day to say yes to their husbands and to create that kind of peaceful space that they have within their homes. This is something we need to understand about what Naga feminism is all about. Naga feminism is something that we cannot compare to the American bra-burning stage. I think this is a slowly evolving stage of women. And it's not only educated women, it is many women in rural areas, many women from the tribes, many women who live in the villages who have been sensitizing their own communities to a large extent. So I think the days ahead, I would still say, I'm still very positive that we are going to see these changes happening. The second point about whether education really can break these kind of mindsets. I'm very sorry. I teach in the university. I teach some of the most intellectual Naga youth who come to my classes. And right from my class, the minute I talk about women's rights and women's reservation, I can make out from their facial expressions which tribes they belong to. I belong to an Angami tribe where women, my mother was the first president of the Angami Women Organization, and women were allowed into their PEC's body decades back. We do have many tribes still now who are much more gender sensitive, but there are certain tribes who are still very resistant towards women's voices being heard. They would not even think of property being sanctioned to them. The minute a husband is gone, your whole identity is lost. Literally, women are even compared to being a leaf, pata. So we've had women leaders who have come to discussions with these kind of definitions, and therefore, what sort of future do we see for gender equity, gender justice, and Naga society? Do we really see it in the hands of the educated youth? We must have that kind of hope. I think we must have that kind of hope. But to have that kind of hope, there has to be a total gender sensitization also of our youth. Because the problem with much of our youth is that we are so conditioned under the mindset of our tribe leaders. We follow them everywhere. We take their words as gospel truth. Very few young people would question their tribe leaders. And I think this is where we are. We are really at the crossroads of a society, but it has to be a fusion of tradition as well as modernity if we are to look at gender equity and gender justice.
Yeah, I'm just taking time to unmute. I agree with Professor Rosemary that I don't think it's a tradition versus modernity debate. One of the things I do through Instagram actually, because it's a medium that has it's a medium that's very used predominantly by youth, is to raise these sort of questions. Is it possible for us to explore, celebrate, and conserve tradition while also voicing feminist narratives, exercising agency over whether it is our body, our politics. These are some of the questions that I raise, and I think it's really important in the sense that there's been a massive response from young people like yourselves, and younger people like me, and as young people as the professor, but I've had some very interesting conversations, and I think what is important, I for one am very grateful for Article 371A, because it allows us Nagas as indigenous citizens of India to enjoy the kinds of rights that I think our indigenous counterparts in the mainland cannot even fathom, at this point in their history. Because I mean, the kind of human rights abuses, the kind of the theft of their lands and their bodies and just their rights, these are things that we cannot even imagine thanks to Article 71A. So I for one am we need this, and this is one of the reasons why we have this very comfortable luxury of being Indian citizens who can think about these issues, who have the luxury to think about these issues. But having said that, I think we need to re-examine what aspects of tradition, we want to keep, we want to conserve. And we need to understand that this thing that we call tradition is not something unchanging and monolithic. It is our right, it is our responsibility as custodians of this tradition to constantly question it, to constantly revise it, and to constantly add elements of new elements that will become tradition at some point. Something that is very often quoted is, we don't headhunt anymore. So, well, then that's proof that there are some traditions and practices that we have done away with. And we don't need, traumatic conversions like Christianity or anything. We just need people who think about traditions, look at traditions through new eyes and interrogate them. Now, when it comes to interrogating traditions and interventions, this is one thing that I want to say is that I honestly don't think that education is the way. I've said this before, but dialogue, there's a difference between being educated and engaging in dialogue. And when I say dialogue, I mean interpersonal, intimate dialogue within family, within community, a dialogue that begins from childhood, and as a mother, as a parent, I find this really, really important. But I don't think all of us need to become parents in order to start engaging in these dialogues. All of you as young people, these are things you must talk about as much as you talk about, BTS's new release or anything that you do. These are dialogues that you must very deliberately engage in across generations and among yourselves, because this is the way mindsets are changed. We already know, and since Vinolen has quoted extensively from Western history, we know that education in the form of, the Enlightenment did not, culminate in anything good. In fact, it actually facilitated and enabled genocide, war, slavery. So this idea that education is somehow always benevolent, always liberating, is something that we must question. And particularly when it comes to us Nagas, we are very lazy readers, and I usually excuse that because I say we are an oral culture. But when it comes to education, most of us Nagas always manage to get ourselves sort of a half education. We barely manage, we barely pass. We kind of skim, read through the text. We don't read the whole text. And what that produces is, an army of certified Nagas, who have the certification to say that they have obtained this educational degree, but who actually haven't engaged in ideas that can potentially be liberating. And I'm not going to cite personal examples, but I think we know of enough very educated, highly qualified male legislators who have joined politics and, in essence, sold their souls, who are not able to live by those very liberating principles that, they should have imbibed in during their education. So these are things that we must, take note of. Especially my appeal to all the students who are attending today is that it is your responsibility to ensure that you are getting, the kind of education that makes you a better person. And by this, I mean, when I say moral education, I don't mean, through religion, etc., but this impulse to look at how what we know, the education, the knowledge, the skills we gain, how we know contributes back to our society. And this ties back to our traditional practice, where a Naga is never just an individual. And a Naga, everything that a Naga learns, everything a Naga does, always is looked at in terms of what value that gives back to society. And that is one tradition that we must keep up.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your answer to my question. We were actually planning to close, but I think if we have time, we'll accommodate one last question by Longjenti Longkumar. Dolig Kikon as well as Sanjeev Baura have touched upon the idea that elections in Nagaland, given the militarization, are mired in money, guns, and booze. As women take the role of mediators and peacemakers, would it be perhaps paradoxical to partake in such violent processions?
Yeah, these are questions and articles that we have read over the years and months from people who live quite far away and who have been observing the Naga mothers and the Naga women's movement for peace. But you need to remember, if we are looking at political participation, if we are looking at giving spaces to women, women would also have to bring in their own methods and techniques into stepping into this kind of arena. It would not really mean that women would be also throwing money, passing around booze. I've always stated in lectures on women's entry into elections, especially in the state of Nagaland, that Nagaland's scenario is actually an election of money and guns. And therefore, as peacemakers, as women who have struggled for peace for decades, right from apex organizations like the Naga Mothers, right down to the village women, these are the women who are in touch and who are well acquainted with the Naga political groups. A time, I think, will come if one day we are going to see that kind of a scenario. Wouldn't it be easier for women to have access to at least the guns, if not the money? Has always been the question, because for women to step into elections, if money is a criteria, the other side is guns. If you have the backing of political groups, of Naga political groups, who would definitely want to see women in the forefront and in the political scenario, I think these are the things that we need to look ahead. And to give judgments like, money and booze and guns, and therefore you can't, you really would not be a part of all this. I think you really need to live in the kind of situation that Naga women are living before you keep on commenting on these kind of issues. I think I will leave it to Theye to round it off. I have a webinar at 6 p.m. tonight with the Rotary, and I'm also going to be speaking there. So my gratitude to all of you. And I know, as a strong feminist, Theye is here to give a warm conclusion. And if you don't mind, you probably will see me exiting.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your time.
Thank you so much, Professor. It was very nice to be on the panel with you. You know what? One thing is, I think some scholars do tend to sort of give militarization too much importance. That's not to say that militarization has not changed the fabric and of Naga society traumatically. I'm not saying that, but the thing is, I think now to say that violence in Naga society only came or came into existence post-militarization is a fallacy, because we know that violence was always there. We also, as all other societies, we've always been violent in our different ways. How militarization has maybe perhaps amplified this violence in certain trajectories is something that maybe we can say accept. But having said that, it's like saying the house is very dirty, and because the house is dirty, I'm going to sleep outside. Even if the house is dirty, you need to clean it up. And very well equipped and qualified to undertake this job of cleaning things up, of doing things differently. And the thing is, you need to remember, we're half the population of Nagaland. We have also been leading our lives and contributing to Naga history and indirectly contributing to Naga politics. We have also been contributing, and that is how, it's not that we're just giving birth to generations of Nagas. We also have, played a very big role in determining what we Nagas are today. So in that sense, when we say the question of not participating in these processes does not arise, we already participate in these processes. The question is it possible for us, because they say housework, housewives, the work of the home, domestic work and space is unpaid labor, and in that sense, even our political work as of now is unseen, unrecognized, and unpaid. And the paid part, who cares about? But is it possible for women to now really visibly join the political arena? Because to say that we are actually not participating, because remember, when it comes to voter turnout, women exceed men in many constituencies. So we have been playing a big role. Is it possible for women now to be seen and recognized as real political actors?
Thank you so much for your extremely insightful answer to that question. I think we have now come to the end of the meet, and yeah, thank you everyone who came and participated, and also to everyone who stayed with us and enjoyed the discussion while learning new things at the same time. I'm very sure that many of us have learned many new things today. Special gratitude goes to, of course, our honorable panelists. Professor Rosemary, as mentioned before, had to leave because of a webinar she had. And yes, special gratitude goes to you as well, Professor Theyiesinuo. Thank you very much for joining us today. And yeah, thank you, everyone. You can now start leaving. This is the end of the meet. We will now be ending the meet.
Thank you very much. Good evening.